Hello and welcome to the viewers of this video. This is the Orange Fan here, bringing you another entry for the episode Recap and Thoughts category. This video will be dedicated to episode 18 of Young Justice, Secrets. We begin this episode in New York City on October 31st, Halloween, where Detective Jim Daniels and several police officers are at a museum because the museum curator called them to report a stolen artifact. The curator says that the stolen artifact was the sword of Beowulf, and not just a replica, but the actual sword itself. The curator also mentions that the sword possesses great power, but only a pure-hearted individual can use the sword, and they would need to say a specific incantation to activate the sword's powers. He also says what the incantation is. Jim Daniels doesn't really believe the great power part of what the curator is telling him, but he says that the thief is probably long gone by now, only for the thief to reveal that he's right under their noses. And he reveals himself to be someone who calls himself Harm, voiced by Ben Diskin. He talks in the third person and he refers to everyone else as it. He also mentions that he needed to figure out what the incantation was, and since the curator said it not too long ago, Harm knows what it is now, and he says it, and now he can use the Sword of Beowulf's powers. The curator, though, is baffled because he says only a pure-hearted individual can use the sword. And Harm says, yes, a pure-hearted person is the only one who can use the sword, but pure-hearted doesn't mean pure good necessarily. There is such a thing as pure evil, after all, and Harm falls under pure evil, so he can use the sword. And after he takes care of everyone in the museum at the moment, he leaves and says that he's hoping to find a greater challenge. We then cut to Mount Justice, where we see the Young Justice team, or three of the members of the Young Justice team, are preparing for a Halloween party at Happy Harbor High School. Superboy is going as a mummy, Miss Martian is going as a zombie, and Kid Flash is going as a werewolf. We also heard that the other members of the team, and even Zatanna, were invited as well. And we see that Captain Marvel is there also he has face paint to resemble a zombie, and he's voiced by Chad Lowe, Rob Lowe's younger brother, starting with this episode because Rob Lowe had some schedule conflicts that happened starting around the time the recording for this episode. Yeah, the voiceover recording for this episode was happening, so that's why Rob's younger brother is taking over the role now. But in any case, Captain Marvel thought that they were all invited, but he didn't realize they meant just the Young Justice team. But they think that Captain Marvel was planning to go to a Halloween party for that the Justice League was having. So Captain Marvel decides to leave to go trick-or-treating, and he doesn't intend to share any candy, which confuses everyone. Artemis and Zatanna both arrive, and they're in their costumes too. Artemis is in a vampire costume, while Zatanna has a witch costume. And Zatanna notices Superboy and Miss Martian's she figures out that Superboy and Miss Martian are a couple, and she questions Artemis how long that was going on for. And at first, Artemis thinks Zatanna is mistaken, but when she actually pays attention, she notices this, and she becomes frustrated about it. Zatanna tries to convince Artemis not to leave because she didn't mean to upset her, but Artemis doesn't really feel like going to the party anymore, but she doesn't think that just staying home at night with her mother is going to be much fun. So Zatanna suggests something else. She casts a spell which changes their Halloween costumes into their superhero costumes, and then they use the Zeta Beam technology to head to Manhattan to do a little patrolling. And as for the three Young Justice team members we saw earlier, they go to Happy Harbor High School for the Halloween party, where Miss Martian and Superboy, to a lesser extent, introduce Kid Flash to the students that they met in the episode Targets, and it seems like they're all friends now. But Marvin is paying more attention to reports of a supposed invasion about to happen, or an alien invasion is apparently meant to happen on this particular Halloween. But Lucas Snapper Carr, who is a chaperone for the party, says that it's just a Halloween prank that tends to happen a lot. And he mentions that there's no way that Martians would attack because Martian Manhunter, a member of the Justice League, is a superhero. But Marvin still seems pretty convinced about these alleged reports. Back at Mount Justice, we see that Aqualad and Robin, even though they were invited, they ended up staying at Mount Justice, where they're meeting up with Batman, Red Arrow, and Red Tornado to talk about the mole. And while Aqualad is now pretty convinced that Sportsmaster simply lied about the mole in order to divide the team up, Red Arrow is convinced that there is a mole. Red Arrow points out that Artemis is suspicious since she's not actually Green Arrow's niece as was originally claimed. Aqualad is actually surprised to hear this, but Robin says he knew that, and he's about to say who Artemis is related to, but Batman stops his young protege, saying that Artemis has a right to a secret identity, as they do. And, that's right. Batman says that he thinks Superboy might be the mole, but unwilling on his part, or not aware of it, saying that who knows what Cadmus had programmed into Superboy before before Robin, Aqualad, and Kid Flash found him in his pod at Cadmus. Who knows what they were able to program in him before then. Red Arrow also comments that he heard I think he heard from Black Canary that Martian Manhunter first met his niece, Miss Martian, 5 months ago. So I believe that would be in May, since this is in October, this episode. So I believe that would be in May, because Martian Manhunter has over 100 nephews and nieces, and she apparently stowed away on his spacecraft when he was returning to Earth after visiting at Mars for a while. But Aqualad is still pretty certain that none of his teammates are the mole. Back in Manhattan, we see more of Artemis and Zatanna out on patrol, but what they don't realize is that Harm ended up finding them, or they caught Harm's attention at one point, and so he's been lurking in the shadows, following them and observing them, and he decides that they will be worthy challenges for him. Eventually, Harm reveals himself to the two young heroes, and he pieces together that they are the apprentices of Green Arrow and Zatara because their costumes are similar to those particular Justice League members. So he decides that once he's taken care of Artemis and Zatanna, he thinks that will be sufficient training for him so that he can take on those particular Justice League members. And while Artemis and Zatanna do try to fight Harm, they are really no match for the power of the sword of Beowulf. But then they see a girl with a white cloak urging them to follow her, and they do decide that Harm, the power of the sword of the sword of Beowulf's power is too much for them, so they do decide that their best option is to retreat. So they follow this girl around, but when they try to talk to her, all she says is secret. That's all she can apparently say. And so Harm, though, is still determined to chase after them. So we see them, Yeah, they eventually are jumping on the rooftops of buildings while Harm is chasing after them. And eventually they reach a particular house, and Harm is especially furious because this is his house apparently. And then he does manage to overpower them though, and they become unconscious. Back at Happy Harbor, there seems to be more evidence that suggests that this alien invasion that Marvin spoke of is coming true. But thanks to his infrared vision, Superboy figures out that Marvin is behind this. It's just a Halloween prank that he's pulling. So he, Miss Martian, and Kid Flash work together to pull their own Halloween prank on Marvin. They make it look like, Superboy and Kid Flash pretend to be eliminated by the invading Martian, who is Miss Martian, but she's disguised herself as a giant, into a giant form, and it bears the form that Miss Martian has taken. It bears a strong resemblance to Marvin the Martian of Looney Tunes fame. And Marvin freaks out about this, and he tries to warn everyone else at the party. And they're like, yeah, we saw the reports. That was their response. But he admits that was a prank on his part, but they really are invading. But then Superboy and Kid Flash reveal themselves to be A-OK, and Marvin quite nervously responds trick or treat when all eyes are on him. Back at Harm's house, Artemis regains consciousness, but she's tied up to a chair. And she sees a TV, and it shows that Zatanna is tied up in a different room in the house. Harm is where Artemis is, and he questions Artemis how she found his house. Artemis responds, though, that his partner led them there. But this confuses Harm because he says he has no partner. Meanwhile, Zatanna is trying to escape being... Yeah, she's tied up in a chair too, and she has tape on her mouth to stop her from saying her spells. But Secret, the girl that Zatanna and Artemis ran into earlier, appears, and she takes the tape off of Zatanna so she can say a spell to unravel the rope that's tied her. But then she gets a better look at the room she's in, and she pieces together that this is apparently Secret's room, and there's a picture of Secret with Harm, and Zatanna is getting more confused, to say the least. Meanwhile, Harm is pacing back and forth in front of Artemis, trying to figure out what Artemis is talking about a partner, because he says that Artemis is sincere about thinking that he has a partner, but Harm knows he doesn't have a partner. But then when he looks at the TV screen, at first, he seems to have caught a glimpse of Secret, but then when he looks again, he sees Zatanna has escaped, so he tries to stop her, but more of her magic has allowed her to trick Harm so she can free Artemis. So Artemis and Zatanna manage to escape. They're in the yard of the house, and they find like they find a grave. It's not a formal grave, like more like a homemade grave, but it mentions a Greta Hayes. And then the girl comes out from the grave, and they find out Secret is Greta Hayes. And they piece together that Harm is the reason why she's no longer alive. And Harm appears, but Secret is no longer present again. And Artemis and Zatanna call him out for what he did to his sister, and how he had the nerve to put beloved sister on her tombstone, or her homemade tombstone. But Harm says that it's true that his sister was the only person that he actually loved, and so he had to get rid of her in order to become pure-hearted so he can use the sword of Beowulf. But then Secret appears yet again, and at first Harm thinks that this is just one of Zatanna's spells, but Zatanna points out she didn't actually say a spell out loud, and she has to speak in order to use her spells. And when Harm realizes this, he's actually seen the ghost of his sister, and he starts to lose his composure. But he keeps insisting he's not sorry for what he did, but we notice he's starting to talk in first person again, and the sword is starting to reject him now. And Secret pulls... It looks like she's pulling his heart out. At least that's what it looks like. But eventually the sword no longer works for Harm, so Artemis is able to easily take him down. And Zatanna casts a spell to tie him up. They hear the police coming because, there was a big explosion at one point that they used to distract Harm when they were trying to escape. And Artemis is about to mention something about siblings, how a sibling could do that to another sibling, but she stops herself. And Zatanna tries to urge her to speak her mind, but Artemis says she has no secrets. But then when she looks across the street, she points out to Zatanna that it's a place called Abel's House of Secrets, but the neon light sign is only lit up on Secret. And they piece together that the reason Greta says Secret is because that was the last thing she saw before Harm had ended her life. And that's how we end the episode. Now, here we have the Halloween episode of Young Justice. And many fans would probably... from what I've observed, many fans consider this to be the most mysterious episode of Young Justice. There's a lot of mysteries regarding the Hayes family. Greta, who ended up being called Secret, and Harm, who apparently his name is Billy Hayes. And Harm stands out in particular. He's a very noteworthy villain for the Young Justice TV series because... I would say looking at just the first two seasons, since who knows if this will change once the third season is eventually released, but as far as the first two seasons go, Harm is really the only villain in the show who has no affiliation with the Light whatsoever. Like, he doesn't work for them, he doesn't work for someone who works for the Light, and he wasn't even an unknowing pawn of the Light. He was very much his own... doing his own thing, he appears without really any warning, and we don't see him again after this episode. So you could actually make the case that Harm is actually he could be considered a non-video game example of a giant space flea from nowhere. Usually that's used in video games usually for a boss fight that kind of just comes out of nowhere with no warning, no build-up, no context, and then we never hear about it again. There's a couple of video games that have those random boss battles from out of nowhere. But so Harm, you could say, is sort of a non-video game example of that. He's a villain who kind of just popped up with no explanation, no warning, and we never hear from him again. Now, I don't know if that's going to change in Season 3. Will we ever see Harm again? I don't know. I mean, hard to say. But for the time being, Harm really stands out for being the one villain who's kind of disconnected from the rest of the story. And some would say this episode probably overall had the least connection to the main story overall as well. For half of it was a breather episode for the Halloween party. The other half was Harm, who was, again, a villain with no connection to the Light. But we did get some talk about the mole and possible reasons for who the mole might be. So that connected to the story, the main story in some way. And Secret, will we ever see Secret again? Who knows? I mean, that's what I mean. This was definitely the most mysterious episode of Young Justice, to me anyway, and to others I'm sure as well. But it was an interesting watch all the same. And there we go. We've now discussed episode 18 of Young Justice on this channel. Take care, and until next time.